David goes before King Saul, and King Saul's like, okay. So this is where they're at as a society, right? This is where they're at as a fortress, as a force of people. Literally, no man will step up, and so a little boy, essentially a young man, has to step up. And they put the armor on him. It doesn't fit because he's too small. He goes down, and the story. He goes down to this creek, and he's well known to be a marksman with his slingshot. And he gets some stones, right? And he goes out and he faces off on Goliath. And the way the story goes is he stands before Goliath. And in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 45, this is what he says. He says, so that you will know, and the nations of the world will know, that there is a God in Israel. I'm going to defeat you, Goliath. And I'm big time, quoting it here, all right? I'm just paraphrasing. And he says this, he says, so that they don't think that battles are won by swords, I'm going to win this battle. And basically says, so that the world will know there's a God in Israel, I'm going to win this battle. And that's exactly what happens. He's right in the forehead, ends up beheading him. Everybody freaks out. They go on, right? And then becomes this kind of a legendary hero of David, right? Where they actually, as they come back, they sing songs, right? The women are singing songs, and they say, oh, Saul kills his thousands, but David kills his 10,000s. And Saul becomes very jealous, which, who wouldn't be, right, of David? And so he begins to he begins to get pretty jealous, and so he actually seeks to kill him. But David's become friends with the kingly family, and he's like, Dad, you don't have to kill it. He loves you, right? He's for us. He's not against us. And so he eventually convinces his dad not to kill him. So David's invited back into the family. So in the course of many months, they go off to battle. David does this thing again, and of course, Saul gets jealous again. So one night, they're sitting around the dinner table. They finish their meal. David's over there kind of in the corner, maybe writing some song. Who knows what he's doing? He's playing the lyre, whatever the lyre is, right? Some kind of harp, right? And as he's sitting there playing it, Saul gets so angry, he grabs a spear off the wall, and he throws it, launches it at David, and because he wants to pin him up against the wall and kill him. And David somehow escapes. He goes home, okay? And he ends up at home where his wife is. By the way, just so you know, he's married to the king's daughter. Her name's Michael, girl Michael, okay? All right, that's who she is. I don't know how you actually pronounce her name. Michael, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, the point is, all right, it's the king's daughter, and so he gets home, and so Saul actually sends men. This is where we find ourselves. Sends men to surround his home and make sure he stays there, so he can come over the next day and he's gonna take care of David and kill him. And so his wife is like, I don't want that to happen. So she convinces this incredible plan whereby it will probably give David maybe 2 seconds extra, getaway time. So she gathers up. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 19. She gathers this kind of graven image of some sort in her home. It's a stone thing. She puts it in a bed, okay, right? She covers it up with a blanket. And then she gets this kind of plant that looks like hair, and she puts it on over the head, right, and kind of covers things up real well. And then, there's David, right? She's going to trick people into thinking there's a stone statue in there, but it gave him 10 seconds head start, right? So that she lets him down the window, and he escapes. And of course, his wife is like, "What are you doing?" Right? And so this is kind of where we find ourselves. And so in the midst of this, and from this comes this psalm, which is a crazy story in and of itself, right? And there's so much more to this story. If you want to go back, I would encourage you, go back and read the story of David and just the time between, what we just talked about there in 1 Samuel chapter 19, all the way through where Saul at different points is trying to kill David. He's chasing after him. And it's insane, some of the things that take place. And the amount of times David could have actually killed him, and he didn't. But this is where we find ourselves in this psalm. And so David, from memory, and the reason I say that, I don't think he wrote this that night, because he goes to Samuel's house, in the guest bedroom at Samuel's house. I don't necessarily think he wrote this. I think he writes it later. He's kind of thinking back to some things, because in the middle of the psalm, if you look at verse 8, you, Lord, laugh at them. You hold all the nations in derision. My strength I will watch for you. I missed it here. Excuse me. And he continues, and he talks about the people of God and the people of Israel here, and he specifically speaks indeed to this to the nation of Israel. He's speaking almost from the point of a king, okay? And I apologize, I'm having a hard time finding it right now. And if somebody sees it and they're like, "Hey, there's that verse," just yell it out loud, okay? But anyways, he begins to just speak into this idea almost from a king's perspective, okay? So it's kind of like almost like he's looking back at things for us. And so as I was going through this, just a couple of thoughts for us this morning in regards to this incredible psalm. And here you have David, who is he's a godly man. He's doing the work of God. He's working hard for Jesus, right? He's a man of character and integrity. And God allows this stuff to happen in his life. So here's the question for us this morning. This question: why does God allow dark circumstances, struggles, pain, suffering, and maybe even sin in our lives? And I think that's on the screen there for you, so you can kind of hear it again, see it again there. Why does God allow dark circumstances, struggles, pain, suffering, and even sin in our lives? Why does he allow those things? And so before we get to an answer there, and I don't know, the answer is going to be very general, okay? I can't tell you why specifically God's allowing you to go through this specific thing, okay? I don't even know if always we'll find the answer in the moment or even maybe later. But the Bible does speak into this. The Bible speaks into this in a sense that it tells us what he's not doing and also what he's up to on some level, okay? So a couple things. First of all, that you need to see. First of all, when we think about this idea, when we think about these things as present in our lives, okay, the ideas of dark circumstances, struggles, pain, suffering, right, and sin, even the sins that we have, right? Here's what we cannot infer. We cannot infer by their presence that God's indifferent, that he's aloof, or he's on vacation. Okay, just by their very existence, I think sometimes we feel that. We feel like, God, where are you? You ever asked that question? God, what are you doing with this thing? Why would you do this? And maybe it's not even something that's personally happened to you. Maybe it's something you're seeing in the world and you're going, God, where are you? You know, I think we've all asked that question on some level. And here's what I would just encourage you to understand is that it doesn't mean, just because we can't find an answer there, doesn't mean that God's indifferent to it. What we find in the Bible is we find a God who's compassionate. We find a God who's interested in what's going on in life. We find a God who cares about the things of this world. Last week we talked about this idea of justice, that there will be a point where God is going to enact justice. All right, we have to believe in a God like that. If we believe in a God who isn't able to enact justice, then what kind of God are we really worshiping? I mean, even here, I want you to look at, it's an interesting dynamic. Look at verse 8. Verse 7. There they are bellowing with their mouths, with swords in their lips. For who, they think, will hear us? Right? They're going about doing evil things, right? And their question is, who's even watching? Right? But I love David's response to that. And this is something I think in his own heart. He's answering the question of his own heart. Because he says, yeah, who is watching? Maybe he thinks that for a moment. Maybe there's a season where he's like, God, I don't know where you are. Why do you allow these guys to continue to do the things they're doing? But eventually he comes to this conclusion, but you, O Lord, you laugh at them. Right? Who's watching us? The Lord is. That's what he's saying. There's someone watching. There's someone that will hold them accountable for the things that they're doing someday. It may not be right away, but God is not indifferent to the things going on in your life. He's not indifferent to the things going on in the world. He is actively doing something. Because if I don't believe in a God like that, I'll tell you right now, I don't know that I want a God who's indifferent. Do you? I want a God who cares about what's going on in my life. Not just my life, but what's going on in the world. Who cares about the same things that bother me. Who cares about the same things that keep me up at night. Also, I think there's also this dynamic, and this is, actually, there's a guy, he's a well-known guy, Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book, The God Delusion. You may have heard of that book. He's an Oxford professor. He's a chair, I think, of the biology department, if I remember correctly. And when he thinks about this idea of suffering and this idea of what God is doing through it, he kind of, in God's justice and the ways in which God acts it in the Bible, he actually comes to this conclusion that God's an egomaniac. That he's this desperate, whiny little God who just is so desperate for us to worship him that he'll do anything to get us. Okay, and I understand what he means by that. And I think what he means is why would a good, how could he be good if he allows these things to happen, right? He's so concerned about his own glory, he can't take it if someone else is trying to subvert his glory. And so he's going to do anything, whether it's struggles, pain, whatever, he's going to allow it to happen, and he's going to hopefully enact what he wants, which is his own glory. And so he comes across as a bit, and I'm speaking for maybe someone who's thinking this way, an egomaniac. Desperate, needy. Maybe, another inferring that we can't do by the presence of these things is that God is powerless to stop these things in our lives. Is God powerless? A few months ago, we were talking about this very idea of God, of freedom and God's plans and how they somehow interact with one another. And in particular, the reality is somehow God is in control of what's happening in the world. He's in control. But at the same time, there's this idea of freedom of choices and this idea of responsibility for human beings. And somehow, while they feel incongruent, right, it's really just a paradox. The reality is they seem like they don't fit together, but somehow they do. And that's what the Bible speaks to. The Bible speaks to both, somehow interacting with one another. How that all works itself out is difficult for us to ascertain. I think, I'm trying to remember exactly who compares it to this, but they compare it to this idea of light. Light can be viewed as particles sometimes and waves as others. And somehow, that's what it is. We just don't have the resources and the capability to be able to understand why that is. We just know that that's what it is. Right? And so there seems to be this paradox between the responsibility of human beings and yet at the same time, God's being in control and him being sovereign. And they don't butt against one another. They don't contradict one another, but they actually work in sync with one another. And that's what the Bible speaks to. I think some might also infer this when they're in the midst of suffering. And I don't want to say this before we move forward, okay? These feelings are normal. They're normal. And maybe even in the moment, maybe valid for you. If you're in the midst of suffering or you're in the midst of some pain or maybe there's a struggle or whatever it is, I don't want you to think that me saying these things is me saying that that your feelings for these things are incorrect or they're in a sense meaning that they're invalid. No, these are valid things you're feeling. These are real things going on in your life. And for you to feel this way, I don't want you to stay there, right? But I think it's a natural place to be. All right, so sometimes even when we're in the midst of suffering, we almost look at God in this way. We almost look at him like, wow, he's like this kind of a little boy taking pleasure in seeing the anthill that he kicked over and seeing what happens, right? Or with his magnifying glass, he's burning, right, the ants or the hill. And so he's using these things as almost like an experiment. Right? And I think when we face suffering, we have all these feelings kind of bubbling up inside of us, okay? And but what I'm telling you is the Bible, it speaks into this. And we even see this here in the psalm. Because here's the reality. The existence of these situations and the questions and doubts that come with them actually cause us to face ourselves. In 1961, a man named Adolf Eichmann, he was in a sense, he was the father of, or the brain trust behind the death camps. And in 1961, after being captured in Argentina, he's held before the World Council, right? And he's brought before trial for his war crimes and also his crimes against humanity. And there at his trial, they invited a young man who was in one of the camps to speak and as a witness. And Yildiz Nur, he's a young man at the time, he comes in. And he comes in the courtroom. This is on national television. And as he walks inside, he faints. just completely just faints. Now they bring him to, and this is an incredible scene. Can you imagine, right? Here he comes face to face with one of the men who ensured that his people would be brutally murdered and brutally tortured. And he faints. And so there's a lot of assumptions we can make about why. He comes face to face with Adolf Eichmann, and he faints. And so about 20 some odd years later, 1983, so 22 years later, he's interviewed on 60 Minutes. And so they're asking him, they're like, Mr. De Niro, why? Like, what happened? Like, were you afraid? Like, what were you feeling? What was going on in you? And listen to what he says. He says, I didn't feel hate or fear. He said, what came to me was a realization. And he said, I thought, this is not a demon. This is not a super villain. He's an ordinary man. And he goes, in that moment, I realized something very crucial. And it struck me in a way that it caused me to lose, essentially lose my senses for a moment. And he says, I realized that I could be just like Eichmann. He's just a man. And he says something that struck everyone as we would have never expected someone to say this. And here's what he said. He says, there's an Eichmann in all of us. Which is a frightening statement for someone to make. But if anyone can make it, Yildirim could. And here's what we mean. When you go through, whether it's your own sin or whether it's circumstances that are beyond you, outside of you, they do cause you to come face to face with some things. Come face to face with yourself. And what they reveal is this. They reveal what's really inside of our hearts. They show us in whom or in what we place our trust. They show us and they cause us to verify our own belief. They force us to do some things. And I don't want to be, I don't want to be insensitive to tell you that this will be cold comfort for you if you're in a season of some pain right now. It will be on some level for you to hear this reality. But this is the truth. And I think the question I would have, if I could ask God this, I would say, God, is there any other way for you to accomplish this in my life and me not have to go through that pain? The interesting thing is, didn't Jesus ask the very same question? Here he is in the Garden of Eden, moments before he's going to be arrested, betrayed, arrested, beaten, and nailed to a cross and die an excruciating death with the weight of the world on his shoulders. And what does he say? God, let this cup pass from me. Is there another possible way? Now, is that Jesus doubting God's plan? I think it just reveals the humanity in him in that moment. The wrestle even in his human heart. And I think the same could be true, but the answer to that question to Jesus, we know the answer to that, no. It wasn't for him. And I think I would venture to say this, that whatever the things that are happening in your life, specifically these dark circumstances, these struggles that you've gone through or have, or maybe are going through, or maybe you're on the other side of them, right? The pain or the suffering, even the sin in your life, I don't think that God could accomplish in your life what he wants to unless some of these things take place. Now, that's up to him on how they happen. That's up to him on when they happen, all those things. But they can be necessary. And I think they are. When I was a college student years ago, I was a sophomore, and I was in love with this girl named Rachel, who I married. She's pretty awesome. And so I was trying to save some money up. I had spent all of my savings on a ring, okay? And the unfortunate part is you ever talk to somebody about dating and they say, don't get the cart before the horse? And they probably don't say it that way. What they say is, don't do too much too soon, because then you set some expectations, okay? Keep the expectations low. Well, early on in our dating situation, now this is on me. This is not Rachel's fault. I would treat her some very nice meals on mom and dad, like all the time. I mean, I would take her to, we could have went to like McDonald's, right? But that's not good enough. We're going to go to Olive Garden, right? All right, it's not a steakhouse, but it's a step up, right? It was just a constant thing. And now the thing about my parents at the time, this is not true anymore of them. At the time, God had been very gracious to our family, and so my parents were very nice to me. But there came a breaking point, right, where they were like, Chase, that credit card, we're not paying it off anymore for you, buddy. Right? Which was probably it wasn't the hardest thing I've ever faced in my life. But at the time, it was very difficult, okay? At the time, I was like, why would you do, it's one of those things where have you ever been there, like you're trying to manipulate your way to get what you want? And I can't imagine the things that my poor parents, they had to endure so much. And I can't imagine exactly what I said to them, but the reality is, I probably tried to weasel my way out of it, but they wouldn't budge, which was unlike my parents. I could usually massage my way in there to get what I wanted, right? Just because they were so kind and so caring, and I was so manipulative, to be honest. If I'm being honest, and I don't mean that in jest. I literally, like God's working. He's worked through that, right? But they wouldn't budge. But you know what? That was probably one of the best things for me, because I learned some things. I learned that I had to pay my junk off, right? I learned that I couldn't just spend money whenever I wanted to. I haven't learned that lesson all the way. Right, Dave Ramsey would call me the hippie kind of person, or whatever that Dave Ramsey thing is. Right, I'm not the one I'm not a stickler. I like to have fun. I like to party. Okay, but the reality is I had to learn some things. What's interesting, I think it's on the screen. The other day I was watching this very movie from the Dark Knight trilogy, Batman Begins. You guys ever watch that? You remember the very beginning, right? Batman, Bruce. Okay, he falls down into the well, right? And his dad, he breaks his arm. His dad has him, and he's carrying him inside, and he says this very phrase, "Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves up." Now, I want to tell you, that's a really good thing for my parents to do for me. It was a good thing. That was a good statement for Bruce's dad to say to him, right? A parent's job is to make sure you know how to go to the bathroom on your own, right? A parent's job is you know how to tie your shoes. That's good. You need to learn how to do that. Parents' job is learn how to read, teach, to help you with that, right? Feed yourself. Take a shower. I mean, these are the things I'm working on with my own kids right now, okay? Some of them. Caleb is beyond most of this. He's 11, right? Learn how to read, learn how to write. Eventually, and this is where it gets sweet for you guys who have young kids, I'm telling you, this is a sweet moment where everyone can shower themselves and fix themselves a sandwich. Like, that is a glorious space to be in. One day you'll get there. If you haven't had kids yet, just remember that phrase for later, okay? Because it will be sweet, okay? And we're almost there. Sammy can't quite make her own sandwich, but she can do most of the other things. It's important. We need to be able to take care of ourselves, right? The whole point is to send us out. That's the point. But that is not God. God's job in your life is not to make you self-sustaining. That's not what he's after for you. These moments that we're talking about here, that's not what he's after. Because if you're self-sustaining, I'm telling you, you're not enough. I just want to be upfront with you about that. I don't mean to be rude about that. I just mean no one is. There's never a day where you'll outgrow your need for God. I think it's actually the opposite. He brings these things into our lives at different times and at the right rhythm and at the right moment to show us some very specific things of our need for him. And here's one thing I want to say before I tell you some of those things that he wants to do. I want you to understand this very clearly. God is doing something in the midst of the things that he's allowing in your life. These dark circumstances, this suffering, this pain, the sin, all of it. He is at work through it. Now, what I'm not telling you is that God is, by the way, I just want to make this clear. I'm not telling you God causes you to sin. What I'm saying is he does allow it sometimes because he could stop you. But he allows it. He allows even those struggles that may turn into some sins or make you run towards some sins. He allows these things for a purpose, and he is in the work of it. It is not meaningless. It is not wasted. I want you to look here at 2 Corinthians chapter 4. I believe it's on the screen for us. I believe. I may have a quote right before that, but we can go back to that quote here in a second. Look at what it says. So we do not lose heart. Now, Paul here, as he's writing this, here's what he's saying. He's saying, listen to me. We're going through all these things. And right before that, he talks about all of the struggles and the suffering that is happening to him because he's following Jesus. And because he's planting churches. And because he's a missionary. And because he's working with people. And he's all these things that are happening to him. Beaten with rods and shipwrecked and all of the rest of the things. And he says, but we're not held down by those things. We're not going to be destroyed by them. And here's why. Because God's at work in them. And through them and through the things that happen to us, actually more people are coming to know Christ. This is really the sense of the point. And at the very end, he concludes this, and he's really speaking it into the heart of the people of the church in Corinth. Here's what he says. Do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. I think there's more to it than that. You need to hit the next slide there, Keith. Thanks, bud. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. He's saying, he's at work through these things. The things that are happening to you are not wasted. They're not meaningless. They have a point. So here's the idea. And these are my own words, but I put them on the screen because there's a lot of them. God's purpose in this is something like an artist chipping away at a piece of stone to make a beautiful work of art. The jeweler who digs to find a rock and places it in the refiner's fire to reveal a beautiful gem and stones. Or like the blacksmith who takes the metal and places it in the fire to make the metal more pliable. And its effects, the interesting thing about it is its effects, the effect it has is not just for us, it's also for others as well. And that's kind of Paul's point here. That it's doing something not just in us and not through us, but it's also for others. Right? I have kids, Caleb and Samantha, who watch everything that I do. Since little kids, they've been mimicking me. They've been watching me. And they watch me sometimes go through hard and difficult things. And what happens is that God is at work through that and actually is showing my kids, right, as he works through me, that, you know what, he cares about me, that he's at work in my life. For David, this was an early lesson for him because David was going to go through some very dark moments. As we read his words, as we've read his words this morning, he was going to go through some very dark moments in his life. He's going to go through some very difficult experiences, whether it's his own, like I said, it's suffering and pain and sin and dark times and kids running away, and his kid actually takes over his throne. I mean, there's all kinds of things that take place in the midst of David's life. The loss of a son, all of the deaths of multiple points of his kids, right? He's got one of his daughters is raped by one of his other sons. I mean, there are terrible things that happen in David's life. And early on, David's being refined in some ways to be the king that God wants him to be. I'm going to end with, we're going to skip past those notes there, Keith, and we're going to go to the story of William Cooper, just for the sake of time. William Cooper, reading this actually, I found this story out of, and I've listened to John Piper talk about it too, but John Piper is a pastor and author up in Minneapolis. I think he's retired now. But he wrote this book called, and it's just some little biographies about different, men and women. And in the midst of it, he writes the story of William Cooper. William Cooper was born in 1731. This means that Benjamin Franklin would have been around the same time Cooper was, okay? Just to put that in perspective about the time frame of when he lived. He was contemporaries with, if you know, Jonathan Edwards, who would have been right in that mix, or John Wesley and others, Georgia, multiple different people in the midst of the Great Awakening, number 2, I believe. But by the age of 6, William had 4 siblings who had died. And then his mom, in the midst of giving birth to his only remaining brother, she died as well. Then his dad sends him to, when he's 6 years old, he sends him off to boarding school. and basically is abandoned by his own father. And in the midst of this, not only is he away from his dad, he doesn't have any family that's really involved in his life, but then he's bullied, and this probably more than likely more than just physical and mental, although that's bad enough as it is. There's probably more to it than that, based on his own memoirs. He fancies himself to be a bit of a poet, and actually he publishes multiple poems throughout his life and hymns. And in the midst of his life, Benjamin Franklin actually read his poetry and gave him a good review, which is pretty cool, right? John Newton, you might know the hymn he wrote, Amazing Grace, right? He was his pastor at one point in his life. He would actually invite William to write some hymns in their church's hymnal. But when William turned 21, he had this debilitating, paralyzing depression. Back then they called it melancholy, that just overtook him. And the way it's communicated, he would stare out of windows for days on end during these seasons. He had 4 of these in his life. They happened about, according to him, they happened about every 10 years or so. And he would just be struck with depression and overwhelmed by it. And so, at this point, at 21, he was not a believer. He did not put his faith and trust in Christ. These seasons would incur all kinds of things and eventually would lead to him to make multiple suicide attempts. And so during his second kind of season, he was in his 30s, he had some disappointments in his life, and he tries to commit suicide, and every single way he tries, it doesn't work. And his family finds him, and caring about him, they send him off to an asylum. He was institutionalized. And by providence, coincidence is not the case, it's by providence, he was placed under the care of Nathaniel. Was a believer, and he genuinely cared for William. And they had multiple discussions, and William thought he was despicable. God could never love him, that he was beyond God's grace. And over time, Nathaniel would continue to witness to him. And William had other friends in his life who had also witnessed to him as well. And Nathaniel would place a Bible kind of near where William was, and hoping that he would read it. And one day he did. And he read about John, read from John's gospel about Jesus. And he said, I'm seeing in this Jesus a compassionate person to the most despicable of people, just like me. And that continued for a while. Eventually he read Romans chapter 3. And in it he put his faith and trust in Christ. Now here's where I tell you William's story. It's not a success story. Because as I mentioned before, he had 2 more decades of some struggles in his life. He died when he was 69, so at this point he was in his 30s, so he had 30 more years and roughly about 2 more deep depression episodes after he met Christ. And here's why I tell you this, because William, the interesting thing about it is that William never really quite could get over that. In some sense. In fact, if you read some of his poetry, sometimes you can tell which season he was in because he's very dark. But he never lost his faith as well. And here's why that's important, right? A lot of times we like to hear stories about these because we want to hear success stories, right? If we want to lose weight, we don't want to talk to somebody who struggled with weight their entire life and who will continue to struggle for the rest of their life. We want to meet someone who they had a struggle, they got over it, and now, okay, we can learn from them. Right? They don't put the guy on Weight Watchers or the girl on Weight Watchers who will always struggle with her weight. That's not typical, okay? You want to know why? Because it doesn't sell. This is encouraging to me because I also know that God is at work in the midst of those struggles. And the interesting thing is, a few centuries later, here we are talking about William Cooper. And not because he ever got over his struggles. In some ways, he is now in heaven, right? But in the midst of this, he wrestled with this. It's the complexity of all of us, right? The reality is we still live in a fallen world. We still live in a world that has its issues, and we still have flesh that is on us. Even though we have a new spirit, even though we have become new creatures, we still have this old flesh that continues to do battle with us, as Romans chapter 7 says. And therefore we have the struggle. So I want to encourage you this morning not to lean into and just accept, right, that, well, I got to give up. No. That's not what I'm telling you to do. I'm just telling you to lean into the reality that in the midst of the struggles, God is going to show you his overwhelming grace. That even him allowing it to persist is actually a grace to you. And to lean into it. Because in the midst of his grace, in the midst of his mercy, we find overwhelming peace. And if there's a struggle that you've struggled with your entire life, know that there's hope beyond it. Okay? But there's hope beyond it in the power of the resurrection. And we do not lose heart, but we take fresh courage. Listen to William Cooper's words. For the clouds of suffering we so much dread are big with mercy and shall break blessings on our head. God is at work and none of it's wasted, even in the midst of your struggles. And I want you to know that in the midst of that, the intersection of God's grace, listen to David's words here in Psalm chapter 59. Listen to what he says. After all of this, right? The way it's written, he struggles, he asks God to help. He has a moment of, aha, I'm going to trust in you. I'm going to put my hope in you. I'm going to find my hope in you. My strength, I will watch for you. But then it continues to persist. But look at verse 16. But I will sing of your strength. I will sing aloud of your steadfast love. That's mercy. In the morning. For you have been to me a fortress and a refuge in the day of my distress. O my strength, I will sing praises to you. For you, O God, are my fortress, the God who shows me steadfast love. I hope and pray for you this morning as you consider these things that, first of all, you understand God's at work, but also that inside of this is where you find that strength and that mercy, that grace and that mercy, that it's actually a collision of those things. Right, that's what David is saying, is that when in the midst of this we find our need, and we find our need is only in Christ, that in that moment there's a collision of grace and mercy in our life, where we seek and we understand that we'll never grow out of our need for him. And in the midst of that, we find praise, and we find it to be him to be praiseworthy. And as we praise, also it has an influence on those around us. And what we're going to do this morning is what we'll do. We're going to do two things. Just a moment, I'm going to pray, and after I say a prayer, we're actually going to listen to a kind of a redone version of William Cooper's, one of his hymns that he wrote, called God Works in Mysterious Ways. And you're more than welcome to sing along. There'll be words on the screen. But I just want you to let these words sink deep into your heart. Words that are built off of the power of the gospel. And then what we'll do at that point, Bryant will come up and he'll have you stand, and we'll sing, and then we'll be dismissed by benediction. But at this moment, I'm going to pray. God, thank you. I thank you for your word. I'm grateful for how you work through your word, and I'm grateful for how you, and even in this, that God, you're working through everything that happens in our life. Somehow this intersecting of your plan and the things that are happening to us, things that we're doing. God, none of that's wasted on you because you are at work. God, therefore I have hope. I have hope that you're not absent, but you're at work in my life, and you're at work in the world around me even. And I can see you at work. Obviously, God, our whole hope is not settled on, these things just ending, but you coming again and making right those things that are wrong, and taking the sad things and making them untrue. But God, in the midst of that, we know, as we look to your son Jesus, we know all of the suffering and all of the things you went through for us. And therefore, we have a God who understands what we're going through. God who's compassionately loving us through these moments. And a God who has done what we could never do, which is rescue us from our sins. So God, therefore, we have hope. We have hope for our life now. Even in the midst of struggles that may or may not persist, we have hope of the intersection of your grace and your mercy. But at the same time, God, we also have hope for the life in the next, when all of this will be undone. Therefore, God, we can praise you. It's in Jesus' name we're able to pray. Amen.